The motorcycle was already loaded onto a trailer in the driveway when I walked outside in my dress blues, my father's flag still folded against my chest. The moving truck's engine idled behind it. Two men I barely recognized were carrying my father's gun safe down the porch steps like it was furniture from a yard sale, and Renata Kingsley stood on the lawn with a clipboard, checking items off a list while the reception inside the house was still going, while the casseroles were still warm on the dining table, while my father's body had been in the ground for exactly 90 minutes. "Renata," I said, "what is this?" She didn't even look up from the clipboard. "Estate sale, honey. Cash only. You're welcome to make an offer on anything before it's gone." That's when the convoy turned onto the street. Not one truck, not two. A line of vehicles, headlights cutting through the gray afternoon, and the man who stepped out of the lead truck was wearing his Marine Corps service uniform, chest full of ribbons, sergeant major stripes on his sleeve, and he looked at that motorcycle on the trailer like it had personally insulted him. He set his cover under his arm and said the words that changed everything. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that clipboard down, because in about 10 minutes, everything on this lawn is going to become evidence." Backstory. My name is Captain Naomi Vance, 29 years old, 7 years in the United States Marine Corps, currently serving as a logistics officer attached to a maintenance battalion at Camp Lejeune. I grew up an only child of a widowed father, and I never once doubted that the man who raised me was the finest Marine I would ever know, even though I outranked him by the time I made captain. My father, Walter Vance, enlisted at 18, straight out of a small town outside Wilmington, North Carolina, and spent 26 years turning wrenches on trucks that other men's lives depended on. He retired a gunnery sergeant, the kind of enlisted Marine that young lieutenants secretly feared more than any colonel, because he had forgotten more about diesel engines and leadership than most officers ever learned in a career. 3 separate generations of mechanics at Camp Lejeune's motor pool trained under him at some point, and to this day I meet strangers at Marine Corps functions who ask if I'm Gunny Vance's girl, and light up when I say yes. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 11. I remember the hospital more clearly than I remember most of elementary school. The beeping monitors, my father sitting in a plastic chair for 18 hours at a stretch, refusing to leave her side even when the nurses gently suggested he go home and rest. After she passed, it was just the two of us in a small house outside Jacksonville, him teaching me to change my own oil in the driveway on Saturday mornings, explaining that a Marine who couldn't take care of her own gear had no business leading anyone else's. He taught me to shoot, to change a tire in the rain, to read a torque wrench, and most importantly, to never let anyone see me rattled in public, no matter what was happening underneath. "Composure isn't the absence of feeling something," he used to tell me. "It's deciding when and where you're going to let it out." He never remarried until 3 years ago, when he met Renata Kingsley at a church fundraiser for wounded veterans. I wanted to be happy for him. I tried, genuinely, because after nearly 2 decades alone, he deserved companionship. But something about Renata unsettled me from the first dinner we shared together. She asked about his retired pay before she asked about his health. She asked what his VA disability rating covered before she asked what his favorite memory of my mother was. Her son, Tyler Kingsley, a 22-year-old who bounced between community college semesters and part-time jobs he never held longer than a few months, started calling my father Pop within a month of meeting him and started borrowing his truck within 2. I brought my concerns to my father exactly once, over a video call from my last deployment overseas. He listened, the way he always listened, patient and quiet on the other end of a grainy connection, and then he told me something I didn't fully understand until the day of his funeral. "Naomi," he said, "I've handled worse ambushes than a woman with a grocery list of my assets. I've got things squared away. Trust your old man." I did trust him. I trusted him through his cancer diagnosis 8 months ago, stage 4 pancreatic, the kind of diagnosis that comes with a countdown instead of a treatment plan. I trusted him through the chemotherapy he pursued anyway, refusing to let it slow him down, still showing up to help old students from the motor pool with their personal trucks on weekends, still calling me every Sunday like clockwork even as his voice grew thinner. My aunt, his younger sister Carol Jenkins, called me twice during those months, worried about how quickly Renata had started referring to the house as ours and the truck as mine, and worried about how often Tyler was suddenly around whenever there was talk of money. "Your daddy's too soft-hearted to see it," Aunt Carol told me once. But I've watched women like Renata circle before. You keep your eyes open, baby. I kept my eyes open from 4,000 miles away, which is to say, not nearly well enough. I had a fellow officer on base, Major Priya Ramirez, who listened to me vent more than once during that deployment about the situation back home, and who told me, more than once, that some fights simply have to wait until you're standing in the same room as the enemy. There was one visit home, about 4 months before he passed, that I still turn over in my mind more than any other. I'd flown in on a short leave, and I found him in the garage at 9 at night, alone, sitting on an overturned bucket beside his old motorcycle, not working on it, just sitting with a hand resting on the fuel tank the way you'd rest a hand on a sleeping dog. He didn't hear me come in. When he finally noticed me in the doorway, he didn't look startled, just tired in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "You ever notice," he said, "how some folks marry a person, and some folks marry a life insurance policy wearing that person's face?" I asked him what he meant. He waved it off, told me he was just tired from the chemo, and changed the subject to whether I was eating enough protein on deployment. I let it go, the way you let things go with a father who has never once asked for help in his entire life. I understand now that he wasn't confused that night. He was already 3 steps ahead of a fight he knew was coming, quietly building a case file the way he used to build a maintenance log, one dated entry at a time, long before anyone else in the house realized a war was even being fought. He also took me, on that same visit, to meet with a notary at a small office off Marine Boulevard, telling me only that he needed a witness for some retirement paperwork. I sat in the waiting room scrolling through my phone, half paying attention, while my father signed documents I never saw the contents of. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Fathers sign paperwork. It's what fathers do. I had no idea I was sitting 20 feet away from the exact folder that would end up saving his entire estate. By the time his diagnosis progressed to the point where hospice conversations started happening in hushed tones in the kitchen, Renata had already begun referring to herself, in front of neighbors and at church, as Walter's wife of many years, rounding 3 years up into something that sounded far more permanent than it was. She started attending his oncology appointments and asking the doctors detailed questions about his prognosis timeline. Questions that had less to do with comfort care and more to do with planning around a calendar. My father noticed. He mentioned it to Earl before he ever mentioned it to me, according to what Earl told me much later, because he didn't want to burden his daughter with suspicion while she was still 4,000 miles away carrying out her own duties. I flew home for 1 week of emergency leave during his final month, and I remember sitting with him in the living room while Renata hosted what she called a prayer circle in the dining room, a gathering of women from her church, who spent more time discussing estate sales they'd attended in other counties than they spent praying over my father. He caught my eye across the room during one particularly awkward exchange about liquidating unnecessary assets, and he gave me the smallest shake of his head, the same gesture he used to give me in formation when I was about to speak out of turn. "Wait," that gesture said. "Not yet." I didn't understand what I was waiting for until the day the moving truck showed up in his driveway. The last real phone call I had with my father came 2 nights before he passed. His voice was thin, but his mind was sharp as ever, cutting straight through the small talk to what mattered. "Naomi, there's a fireproof box in my closet, top shelf, behind the winter coats. You check that box when the time comes, and not 1 day before. You understand me?" I told him I understood. I did not, in truth, understand anything at all. Not the weight behind his voice, not the urgency, not what he was protecting me from. I flew home on emergency leave 3 days later, not for a bedside vigil, but for a funeral, and for 6 days afterward I helped plan a service with full military honors, while Renata, I would later learn, was already planning something else entirely. ACT-2, the incident. The funeral was held on a cold Thursday morning at the Veterans Cemetery outside town. My father's honor guard fired the volley, the bugler played taps, and the flag was presented into my hands by a young corporal who could not have been older than 20, his voice cracking slightly as he recited the words every Marine learns before they ever expect to need them. Renata stood beside me at the grave, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, and the moment the family car pulled away from the cemetery, she was already on her phone in the back seat, speaking in a low voice to someone named Gary about getting the truck over there before the reception winds down. I didn't hear that particular call. I only pieced it together later. What I did notice riding back to my father's house with the folded flag still resting in my lap, was a moving truck already idling in the driveway, its ramp down, and two men I had never seen before, carrying boxes out the front door, before I had even stepped out of the car. The reception itself had been planned as something quiet. Neighbors from the street, three of my father's old squad mates from his motor pool days, the pastor from Renata's church, a spread of casseroles and sweet tea in the dining room. Instead, I walked into a house that was being methodically stripped around the mourners still standing in the living room with paper plates in their hands. My father's recliner, the one he'd sat in every evening of my childhood, gone. The shadow box holding his medals, gone from the wall above the mantel, replaced by a pale rectangle where sunlight hadn't faded the paint. His toolbox, the same steel box he'd used to teach me how to gap spark plugs when I was 9 years old, sitting out on the porch with a handwritten price tag taped to the lid. $40, the tag read, OBO. I found Renata in the kitchen, calmly wrapping my father's coffee mugs in newspaper, while three mourners stood awkwardly nearby, pretending not to notice. Tyler was out in the garage with a man named Gary Voss, a wiry stranger in a flannel shirt who ran, as I would soon learn, a small pawn and resale operation out of a strip mall off Highway 17. Together they were backing my father's gun safe onto a hand truck. "Renata, what is happening to Dad's things?" She set down the mug she was wrapping and gave me a look I can only describe as pity, the kind adults give children who don't yet understand how the world works. "Naomi, sweetheart, I know this is hard, but Walter and I were married. Everything in this house is mine now, legally, and I have bills. His treatment left us underwater financially, and frankly, some of us have to be practical, while others get to fly back to base and let the rest of us handle the mess he left behind. You haven't even asked what he wanted done with any of this." "He's not here to ask," she said flatly, and went back to wrapping the mugs like the conversation was already finished. I asked her to stop moving items out of the house until we had clarity on the estate. She refused, told me flatly that there was no will, that Walter never trusted lawyers, and that whatever papers existed were outdated and worthless. When I asked to see any documentation at all supporting her claim to sole ownership, she waved the clipboard at me and reminded me, twice, that my little hobby in the Marines hadn't made me a lawyer, and that grief was clearly making me difficult. The pastor from Renata's church, a kind older man named Reverend Foster who had officiated the service that morning, wandered into the kitchen mid-argument holding an empty plate, clearly looking for the dessert table, and instead found himself standing in the middle of a standoff. He offered, gently, that perhaps everyone should take a breath and revisit the sorting later, once emotions have settled, which Renata brushed aside without so much as a glance in his direction. I remember thinking, even in that moment, that she wasn't embarrassed at all. She wasn't hiding anything. She genuinely believed she had already won. I walked out to the garage to see the gun safe for myself, and that's where I found Tyler crouched beside it, running a hand over the surface like he was already picturing where it would sit, in whatever new place he was planning to spend the proceeds on. Gary Voss stood a few feet away with a clipboard of his own, jotting down serial numbers. Tyler was worse. He walked past me from the bedroom carrying my father's dress uniform on a hanger, still in its dry cleaning bag, the same uniform Dad had worn to my commissioning ceremony 4 years earlier. When I reached for it, he pulled it back out of my grasp and laughed. "Relax, Captain," he said, drawing the rank out like it was a punchline. "It's going to a vintage shop downtown. Gary says metals like these move fast. Some collector will get a kick out of them." Something in me went very still. Not loud, not tearful. My father raised me to hold a line under fire, and this, whatever exactly this was, felt like fire. I asked him, evenly, to hand the uniform back to me. He didn't. Instead, he draped it over his forearm like a waiter showing off a coat check, and glanced toward Gary Voss, who had wandered in from the garage to see what the holdup was. "She thinks she's in charge here," Tyler said to Gary, jerking his chin toward me. "Doesn't matter what rank you hold in the Marines when you're standing in a house that isn't yours anymore, sweetheart." One of my father's old squad mates, a retired corporal named Danny Owen, who'd driven 3 hours to attend the service, set down his paper plate at that point and started to step forward. I put a hand up, quiet, the same signal my father used to give his Marines in formation, and Danny stopped, jaw tight, watching. "That uniform belongs to my father's estate," I said. "Not to you. not to a vintage shop, and not for sale. Renata reappeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel, unbothered as ever. Naomi, honestly, I understand you're upset, but making a scene in front of the pastor isn't going to change the fact that Walter and I were legally married for 3 years. That uniform is going with the rest of the estate sale items, and I'd appreciate you letting my son do his job without harassment. His job, I repeated. He's helping me organize what needs to be liquidated, she said. There's a process to these things. You'll understand once you've buried a spouse of your own. I told them both, as calmly as I could manage, that I was calling my father's attorney. I told them both, as calmly as I could manage, that I was calling my father's attorney. Renata laughed outright and told me, again, that there was no attorney, that Walter had died with nothing formalized, and that his estate would simply pass to her as his legal wife under state law. No complications, no daughter's opinion required. Tyler leaned against the doorframe with the uniform still hanging over his arm and told me I should mind my business before somebody makes a call about your attitude at a family gathering. That was the moment I remembered the fireproof box. My father's voice on that final phone call came back to me clear and sudden. Check the box when the time comes, and not one day before. I excused myself, walked past 3 confused mourners still holding paper plates, and went straight to his closet. I found it exactly where he said it would be, top shelf, behind the winter coats, locked, heavier than I expected for its size, with a single sticky note taped to the top in his handwriting. Call Earl first. He'll know what to do. Love you always, kiddo. I didn't recognize the phone number scrawled beneath the name, but I recognized the name itself instantly. Earl Delaney had been my father's battle buddy since 1998. The man who had stood beside him at my mother's funeral 18 years earlier. The man who had taught me to shoot a rifle the summer I turned 16 when my father was deployed overseas. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years. My hands were shaking as I dialed. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him everything in a rush, barely coherent. The moving truck, the motorcycle already on a trailer, the gun safe headed for a hand truck, my father's dress uniform being sold to a stranger named Gary an hour after the funeral ended. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then Earl Delaney said 6 words I will remember for the rest of my life. Naomi, don't let them leave. I'm coming. ACT 3, The Reckoning. He arrived 40 minutes later, and he did not arrive alone. 20 Marines filled the street outside my father's house, active duty and retired. Men who had served under him at one point or another, trained under him, owed portions of their careers to a gunnery sergeant who never let a single one of them fail an inspection unprepared. Sergeant Major Earl Delaney stepped out of the lead truck in his own service uniform, walked straight past Renata's clipboard without so much as glancing at it, and planted himself squarely between the moving truck and the road. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to put that clipboard down," he said, his voice carrying the same, even calm my father used to speak with. "Because in about 10 minutes, everything on this lawn is going to become evidence." Renata's composure cracked for the first time all day. "Excuse me? And who exactly are you?" "Master Sergeant Earl Delaney, retired, now serving as this county's veteran service officer. I'm also the man your late husband named as executor of his estate 4 years ago, notarized, filed with the county clerk, witnessed by a Navy chaplain who is still alive and more than willing to testify to it." He held up a folder as he spoke. Inside it was my father's actual last will and testament, the very document Renata swore didn't exist, alongside a service member's group life insurance beneficiary form naming me, and only me, as recipient of both the death benefit and legal survivorship of the house itself. Federal law is unambiguous on this exact point. A service member's ESCLI beneficiary designation controls over any claim a surviving spouse might otherwise assert, and it cannot be quietly overridden by a family member simply declaring herself the rightful heir. "This house was never yours to sell, Mrs. Kingsley," Earl continued. "Walter transferred the deed into a survivorship arrangement with his daughter over 2 years ago, right after his diagnosis, specifically because he told me flat out he didn't trust what might happen to it otherwise. Everything you've had loaded onto that truck this afternoon, the safe, the tools, the uniform, that motorcycle, belongs legally to the estate of a decorated veteran, and removing it before probate is settled isn't a family disagreement. It's theft under state law. And I've already had the county prosecutor's office on the phone since I left my own driveway. Tyler tried to bolt for the truck's passenger door, uniform still in hand. Two Marines standing nearest simply closed the gap between themselves and the truck, arms crossed, saying nothing at all, and stayed there until a sheriff's deputy pulled up behind the entire convoy, called ahead by Earl the moment he'd first heard my voice shaking on the phone. Renata's voice climbed higher, sharper. "This is insane. He was my husband. I have rights as his widow." "You have every right to grieve him properly," Earl said, quieter now, almost gentle despite the words. "What you don't have is the right to sell a dead Marine's uniform to a stranger for cash before his own daughter finishes reading the eulogy. Walter told me you might try something like this someday. He wasn't often wrong about people." The deputy, a soft-spoken officer named Marcus Hall, began taking statements from everyone on the lawn. Gary Voss, the pawnbroker hired for cash and wanting absolutely no part of a theft investigation tied to his shop's name, unloaded everything back into the house within the hour without a single word of protest, working under the quiet, watchful supervision of 20 United States Marines who did not need to raise their voices even once to make their presence understood. While the unloading continued, Earl walked me through the folder line by line at the kitchen table, the same table where Renata had been wrapping mugs in newspaper only an hour earlier. The deed showed a survivorship transfer executed 26 months prior. The Sigley form, filed directly through my father's service record, listed me as sole primary beneficiary, dated the same week as that notary visit I'd sat through half distracted on my phone. There was even a handwritten letter inside, addressed to whoever ends up handling this mess, instructing that any attempt to sell estate property before probate closed should be reported immediately to the County Veterans Service Office, care of Earl Delaney by name. "He built this like a defense in depth," Earl told me, tapping the folder. "Deed, insurance, executor, all three separate barriers, so that if one got challenged, the other two would still hold the line. That's not luck, Naomi. That's a man who spent 26 years planning for worst-case scenarios and never stopped." Officer Hall confirmed by phone with the county clerk's office that the deed and will were both on file exactly as Earl described, dispelling any last argument Renata tried to raise about updated verbal agreements she claimed Walter had made in his final weeks. When she pushed back, insisting she at minimum deserved compensation for caregiving expenses during his illness, Earl calmly informed her that any such claim would need to be filed formally through probate court, not settled by loading a motorcycle onto a trailer while the ground over her husband's grave was still fresh. By sundown, Renata Kingsley had been formally notified she was under investigation for theft of estate property and for financial exploitation of a deceased person's estate, both prosecutable under the state's protective statutes, regardless of any marital claim she believed she held over the assets. Tyler, still holding my father's uniform bag when Officer Hall arrived, was cited separately for his role in attempting to remove and sell protected estate property. I stood on that lawn holding my father's folded flag, watching 20 Marines quietly carry his belongings back inside the house, piece by piece, with the same careful precision they would have used recovering a fallen brother's gear from a battlefield. Earl found me there once the last box had gone back inside, and he put a steady hand on my shoulder. "He knew," Earl said quietly. "He knew exactly what she was capable of, Naomi. He just wanted one more year of not being alone in that house. That's all he was chasing." The paperwork was always sitting there, waiting patiently for the one day it might actually be needed. Danny Owen and the rest of the Marines stayed until every last item, down to the toolbox with its $40 price tag still taped to the lid, had been carried back inside and set exactly where it belonged. Nobody asked them to. Nobody had to. Before they left, Earl gathered the group on the front lawn for a moment of silence, caps off, facing the house, the same brief ritual they'd have given a fallen Marine in the field. Then, one by one, they shook my hand, told me their names, told me a story each about a man who had once fixed their truck for free, or talked them out of quitting the Corps during a hard first enlistment, or driven 3 hours in the middle of the night because a young Marine's car had broken down on the interstate. By the time the last truck pulled away from the curb, I understood, for the first time, just how large a shadow my father had actually cast. ACT 4. After 3 weeks later, the county prosecutor's office confirmed formal charges against Renata Kingsley: theft of estate property exceeding $4,000 in appraised value, and financial exploitation of a protected estate under the state's Dependent and Vulnerable Persons Statute, a charge that applies even after the original victim's death when assets are stolen from a legally protected inheritance. Rather than risk a trial and a public record far more damaging than a quiet plea, she accepted an agreement that stripped her of any remaining claim to my father's property and required full restitution for items already damaged during the attempted move, including a cracked housing on the motorcycle's fairing and water stains across two of my father's dress uniforms that had been left sitting in an open truck bed overnight. Tyler lost his part-time job at the auto parts store 2 days after his name appeared in the local paper's court docket listings. His community college advisor, as it turned out, was a Navy veteran himself, and he quietly suggested Tyler not bother returning for the spring semester. Last I heard through my aunt, he'd moved 3 counties over and was, in her words, keeping a much lower profile these days. I was promoted to major 5 months later, an assignment I'd been tracking for over a year, and the timing felt strangely fitting rather than coincidental. My father's house is legally mine now, the deed cleared through probate exactly as Earl Delaney had promised it would be, and every drawer, every tool, every metal was accounted for and returned to its rightful shelf, catalogued personally by Earl before he ever handed me the keys. His dress uniform hangs in my own closet today, pressed, protected, and mended where it needed mending. The very uniform Tyler once tried to sell to a stranger for a laugh. Earl Delaney still calls me every single Sunday, the same day my father used to call. He stood at my promotion ceremony in his own dress uniform, positioned exactly where my father would have stood if he'd lived to see it, and he told me afterward, over coffee, that Walter had asked him months before his diagnosis worsened to keep an eye on my girl if I'm not around to do it myself. Aunt Carol Jenkins was there too, in the front row, dabbing at actual tears this time instead of performed ones, and she leaned over to me afterward and said simply, "Your daddy would have worn a hole in the floor pacing with pride." Danny Owen, the retired corporal who'd nearly stepped in on that porch, sent a card that read only, "Semper Fi, Major. Your old man is smiling somewhere. I keep it on the same shelf as the flag." Renata's restitution payments, court-ordered and monitored quarterly by the county, cover the appraised value of every damaged item, including the cracked motorcycle fairing and the water-stained uniforms, and she is barred under the plea agreement from any future contact with my father's estate or with me directly. I have not spoken to her since the night Officer Hall read her the notice on that lawn, and I don't expect to. The warmest part of that entire ordeal came almost by accident, months after the dust had settled. While clearing out the fireproof box for good, I found a second, smaller envelope tucked beneath the folded will, one that even Earl hadn't known existed. Inside was a single photograph of my father and me at age 9, both of us covered in motor oil and grinning beside his old pickup truck, and on the back, in his familiar handwriting, a note dated the same week of his diagnosis. "For the day someone tries to take what's ours, remember who taught you to fight clean and fight smart. I love you always, kiddo. Dad!" That photograph sits framed on my desk today, right beside the folded flag he was buried under. Every year now, on the anniversary of his passing, Earl Delaney and a handful of the same Marines who filled that driveway gather quietly at my father's grave, and each of us tells one story about the gunnery sergeant who taught half a maintenance battalion how to hold a line, even from far beyond it. Last year, standing at that grave in the early morning cold, Earl brought something new, a small brass plate he'd had engraved himself, meant to sit beside my father's headstone. It read simply, "He planned for the fight so his daughter wouldn't have to fight alone." I didn't manage composure that morning. Not the way my father always taught me. I let myself feel it right there in the grass, surrounded by 20 men in dress uniforms who understood exactly why, and for once, nobody expected me to hold the line by myself. If this story moved you even a little, leave one word in the comments below. One word that describes what real family loyalty looks like to you. My father spent his last months quietly preparing for a fight he never lived to see unfold. Not out of suspicion, but out of love. Because that's what protecting the people you care about actually looks like most of the time. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a fireproof box in a closet, waiting patiently for the one phone call that matters most. And if this story reminded you that the people who love us fiercely are still fighting for us long after they're gone, subscribe. Because next video, I am telling you about the Navy widow who was denied her husband's survivor benefits by his own commanding officer, until a four-star admiral walked into the hearing and revealed exactly who she really was. I'll see you there.